David Murren specialises in using the past to predict the future and is an accomplished public speaker, hedge fund manager and market trader. To date, he's authored 3 books: Breaking the Code of History, Lions Led by Lions and Now or Never. His 4th, The Road to Wars, is due to come out in 2021. He also writes a blog on his website www.davidmerrin.co.uk where you can find more on his life, views and work. Hi guys, back again, and this time we're here for something you haven't tried before. We're going to review one of Dad's new publications. You up for it, Dad?
Always up for it with you, Winnie.
He's raring, he absolutely loves it. So today we're looking at Red Lightning, How the West Lost World War III to China in 2025. This is a short fictional book looking from a post-World War III perspective where China has mounted a surprise attack against Western forces and has successfully defeated the West in combat. Essentially. Is that about it, Dad?
Pretty good.
It's meant to shock and awe you into realising the threat that the West is facing. Am I getting it all?
Yeah, you're getting it
Fantastic.
all. Don't worry.
So, Dad, can you just outline the origins of this for us and where you got the idea from, what underpins it and the theories behind it?
So, with pleasure, Winston.
Lovely, Dad. Thank you.
Its genesis really goes back to Breaking the Code of History, because having highlighted these patterns of 5 phases of empires and pieced the world together up until the formation of the ideas, we're really in just after 9/11. The construct there was the decline of the West, the decline of the last of the Western Christian empires in the form of America, and 9/11 was the marking point between overextension and decline. And we would see in the decades ahead a declining Western power base and a rising Chinese power base that would surprise everyone, because China was essentially in expansion to empire which was asymmetric and exponential. And that's exactly what's happened. And in the book I highlighted a new arms race which would be predominantly around maritime power as China sought to knock American naval dominance from the globe, as America once did to Britain, covertly through the First and Second World War. And a space race that would be accompanied by it. Just about everything that I've talked about in the book and predicted, sadly, is coming true. What alarms me, and I was concerned we would see it, is that in decline the Western powers wouldn't focus sufficiently on their military defence and capability such that they could deter an aggressive Chinese paradigm. And as we've moved closer and closer to a date which I set around 2025, because of the contractive commodity cycle coming to a peak, in all probability that's the greatest risk of conflict between 2 consuming societies, and therefore commodity prices going through the roof and always being the trigger for conflict. What isn't talked about in World War I, for example, is that was triggered timing-wise by a commodity cycle high, and only went higher because obviously through war they became more scarce and harder to get hold of. So essentially there's a very similar paradigm to the run to 1914 to the run to 2025. And as we get closer, I've been increasingly concerned about Britain's failure to wake up and create an active defence policy. And America looked like it was under Trump, but it was rhetoric. And in effect, the expansion of the US Navy is really the contraction of the US Navy. They just haven't got their act together. And that has only encouraged the Chinese to build potentially the biggest navy in the world and create some strategies which I became increasingly aware of could be used to win a surprise strike. So the next step in that evolution was I wrote a thing called the Now or Never Defence Review. It was last year. It was really designed to wake the British leadership up to the threat of what we faced, especially in the new global Britain paradigm of a return to a global maritime paradigm, would put us face to face with the Chinese desire to expand across the oceans. So whether we liked it or not, we were on a course that headed straight for the Chinese coming at us, separate of everyone else and the global shift and chess game being played. And so I wrote Now or Never as a moment where, unless we put money into defence at this review, we would seriously not be ready because of the time it takes to develop the weapons, build them and deploy them by 2025 and 27. And although we were successful in getting into Number 10, Boris Johnson, the MOD, the Treasury, and interestingly enough, that surprise Boris announcement occurred 3 weeks after the publication arrived on all the desks. And
he's listening. He knows what we're saying.
One can only wish he is. But essentially, I think it had a part to play in a shift of mindset, which at least prevented the deterioration overtly to our forces. However, the recent defence review, I think, was incredibly disappointing. It was really,
But doesn't it follow the trend of disappointing defence reviews over the past few years?
The other one...
It's not like it's a new disappointment.
But the previous ones were overtly disappointing, with no aspirational reality to the threats we faced. The Cameron years and before that were just appalling. But in this one, we've turned to face the threat. We recognise there are threats, and yet we've done nothing about it. Before, we didn't even see the threats. So there is a step forward that we're talking about the threat of Russia. It was a huge disappointment that I believe that Boris instigated a fudge around the Chinese threat. And that's because of commercial compromise, which is unacceptable. Because as pieces of my narrations talk about, it was very similar with a pro-German sector of British society into 1914, who didn't want to fight Germany, who did business with Germany, and therefore undermined our response. And we failed to deter Germany with a sufficient reserve army that could have been employed in Europe to counter the balance. So we suffer the same covert undermining of our sort of ability to stand up to the Chinese and indeed the Russians at times because of the way our society's been undermined, and we need to wake up to that. So I woke up on just after the review or around it thinking this review is going to be a complete disappointment. I need to explain to people how real this threat is, and this idea that China is a strategic challenge, and the idea that Britain thinks it's all about the grey zone is a passé idea, in my opinion. It should have been enacted 10 years ago. Right now we face a kinetic threat of mass weapons deployed against us. And our paradigm of the grey zone would have been appropriate a decade ago because we've been torn apart in that space of IP transfer, IP theft. But actually right now we should be focusing on kinetic capabilities and mass. And innovations in technology that can be immediately applied, not ones we hope will turn up in 10 years when we suffer a capability gap, which is exactly when we need to be deterring aggression. And at the same time, I became more and more concerned about the Chinese aerial denial weapons through the DF-21s, which are ballistic missiles with mounted anti-ship warheads, soon to be hypersonic, possibly are already, which means that when you fire one, it goes through the airspace like a ballistic missile, but it's aimed at a carrier group. And if you fire more than a certain number, you can saturate the escorts. And American escorts do have anti-ballistic technology in the form of SM-3s and SM-6s. And essentially this is the story of how it's used into Chinese advantage, which we'll cover in a minute, to win a war.
So, just moving on to the book itself now, I'm going to start asking Dad a series of questions relating to the storyline of the book, and hopefully he'll be able to satisfy me. Fingers crossed. So, Dad, initially you point out that China's 50-year plan to take over the world began in 1996. Was anyone aware of at the time of this 50-year plan? Was this a covert plan? Was it an overt plan? Did people realise its significance?
I don't think the West realised its significance at all. They were focused on that period of hegemonic control and hubris that they didn't really think anyone would threaten American power. And when you think about it, off the first Gulf War, American weapons have proven to be incredibly capable of removing swiftly without relative loss any of the best Soviet weapons. So hubris was running high at that stage. And it was around the same time that the third Taiwan Straits incident happened, where Taiwan became rather belligerent towards China against Taiwan, and Americans passed to nuclear carrier groups and an assault group through the Taiwan Straits, and the Chinese realized they could do nothing about it. So part of their strategy was to grow covertly under the umbrella of American power.
Do you think the Taiwan Straits, or the third Taiwan Straits crisis, basically increased the hubris of the West and increased the disregard of the 50-year plan because America believed they could just sweep China to one side?
I think that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, 9/11 came along. And after 9/11, the Western focus shifted to this neoconservative policy of, well, we've got complete control of the world, let's make it like us. And how can we remove any potential threats? And part of those threats were the issues of proliferation. And there were three proliferating countries perceived to be threats. There was North Korea, there was Iran, and there was Iraq. And through all sorts of, I think, misconstrued routes, there was an architecture and story around weapons of mass destruction, strictly speaking correct because they had chemical weapons and those were one of the three pillars of mass destruction and weapons, but essentially not nuclear weapons as they tried to sort of allude to. And therefore, the irony is in trying to go in the second Gulf War and removing Iraq as a threat or Saddam, that was when the North Koreans slipped through the net and became nuclear. So talk about unintended consequences. Now that was the really beginning of things weren't going well in the Asian basin. But what's interesting is that America was desperate to see China as convertible as part of this neoconservative mindset.
They kind of wanted to see.
They wanted to see
they
China.
Saw they wanted to see,
and they believe that increased access to capital markets would liberalize Chinese society, and democracy will win over autocracy, and the Chinese will become like the West. Now, the Chinese knew they were never going to be like that. What they did rather brilliantly was dangle a piece of bait, which allows them into the World Trade Organization with American sponsorship, and then they enticed American capital to build the biggest manufacturing base in the world, to disenfranchise Western manufacturing because it couldn't be done at a competitive price because of labour costs. Later on, those labour-intensive factories became automated because they made so much money. And of course, if you're going to take your manufacturing base or outsource it to China, you take all your IP too. And of course, there was a massive IP transfer, all paid for by the West, hoping that China would become like it. And you could argue that in 2010, it looked quite a favourable outcome. As we recover from our own financial disasters, I think linked to the terminal phase of the American system, massively debt-ridden, massively leveraged, and we're seeing ruptions because it just isn't a financially viable empire anymore. It's funded through leverage and debt and the printing of money, and any empire that's doing that is in the terminal phase. But anyway, it was only when she came along that something really interesting happened, and it really came after Obama. And coincident with Obama. And Obama...
I think Obama facilitated it through weakness.
I think he accelerated American decline.
But he couldn't have stopped it if it was on the up anyway. If the cycle was set in its trend,
but okay,
it.
So because of
prevented the rise of China.
Because of my theories of entropy. Okay, so when you push back disorder in the universe, then you do it with anti-entropy as a human system. And it takes far more energy to create something than to let it fall apart, because entropy naturally is the downhill process. So it takes far more energy to build an empire than it does to let it fall. And if you do active steps, you accelerate the entropy, which is a natural process. So Obama represented, and this isn't a racist comment, but there is obviously an under-overclass structure in American society that everyone's aware of. But when the underclass raises itself into prominence and power, it's usually because the demographic of the underclass has become big enough to create a voting base to do it, or a power base. And when Obama arrived, it doesn't really matter what his personal qualities are, which I question as well, to be honest, but we can come on to that. His focus was these internal ruptions of society, the social dissonance between groups, rather than the maintenance of the parameters and the borders of the empire. And every underclass rising to prominence in decline does a particularly systematic thing. And in that regard, he did it very well. He completely and utterly screwed up in terms of the island chains and the building of the island chains by the Chinese, which were illegal under the rules-based society of the collective world. When America had enough power to stop it dead, they didn't do that. He was directly responsible for the Ukraine revolution, which then begat Putin's move in there. He was involved in the chemical red line and the sparring between Putin, which pushed him away into Chinese hands, and the invasion of Crimea and Ukraine. At every step, he did the wrong things, which accelerated China's belief it could move faster than its schedule. And along came a man called President Xi, who I have to say, is an incredibly effective leader. He is nothing like the despotic leaders we've seen in the form of Stalin or Hitler or Mao. He is a very considered man who believes his role is to take China, his country, into dominance with complete autocracy of the world. and he accelerated into that gap in the most fascinatingly terrifying way.
In the book, you detail a Russian revolution. You note how Putin loses his grip on power in the future, in fiction, at this point, and Russia then begins to side with the West. At the moment, Putin seems to have a very firm grip on power, but you say that this will happen soon, in line with the commodity cycle. But is that realistic? Do you really believe that Putin will lose power and Russia will change its political alignment?
Okay,
because that seems quite critical to your overall view of China becoming isolated, and then that's how you contain China.
The reason why I did this in the story is not because I consider it the most likely outcome. It's because I wanted to highlight Obama's era of the Ukraine revolution policy that then forced Putin into the arms of China and therefore made Europe a battleground when it could have been a neutral bastion of resource to be exported into Asia to support the containment of China. And so where are we right now? Well, Russia is definitely in real trouble after a decade of low commodity prices, kleptomania by Putin and his oligarchs, and as a result of that, Western sanctions and poor demographics, which are the underlying slide for the Russian system. He is really in trouble. His people have become poorer. They don't like his rule, and essentially along came the opposition, and he's a very courageous man. And essentially we've now got ourselves an internal revolution, and he's obviously in prison right now, Nevsky. He's in prison, and I suspect he will die in prison. And Putin has decided to make him a martyr rather than have him alive. And I think what's relevant is we're going through, only yesterday we saw more people on the street. And we still have another down cycle in the commodity pricing, with oil getting down to sub 40, around 40, which really does do more damage. So I think this next 6 months is quite a critical time for Putin. And Putin is very vulnerable. And now, in that vulnerability, his best defense is aggression. So his forces are building up around the borders of Ukraine. I don't believe that's posturing. I think it's very likely he initiates aggressive action under the pretense that it happened the other way around.
Do you think NATO will defend Ukraine if aggressive action is initiated?
No, it can't. It's not a NATO member, and it's outside the NATO sphere of influence.
But NATO agreed with Ukraine to support them for nuclear weapons being taken away. So then what message does that send in the future?
So that's exactly one of the problems is, as you quite rightly said, they had something like 3,500 nuclear warheads they gave up in the post-90s period, with America saying they would guarantee their safety. And at the time, that guarantee stood up. But when it comes push turns to shove, it's why Putin actually, it's quite powerful for Putin, because what he's doing is eroding the influence and perception of the NATO construct on the edges where it can't really interact. It's a real, we jump up and down, but we can't do things. It's a battle principle that NATO's doing to lose. It's exactly right.
Sounds like a symptom of decline. Going back to the old empire cycles.
And overcommitment. And so he's chipping away at a particular edge. My concern for this particular period and this version of it, and it is in the book, is that the alliance between Russia and China is far more evolved than we perceive. And that each has a pressure point they wish to exert. Putin is in a desperate corner, and his survival depends on distraction. So I think that makes conflict in Ukraine highly likely. The Chinese can go whenever they want to or not, but they want Taiwan back. And so I think these two crises may end up being linked together, and there's a big risk in terms of an untested Biden. And he just made a fundamental error in withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, which is a confirmed failed pilot war.
Just quickly, moving back to the book at hand, as intriguing as your words are, Dad, say that Russia does not experience the revolution. Say that what you detail in the book doesn't unfold. What then? How does that change the outcome of the book? Does that change the outcome?
It doesn't really, because now the West faces a combined Russia and China. And although I mentioned the capability of China to control the eastern sections of Russia, which I think always have to be on Putin's mind, Putin's always going to be worried about the fact he's the last man standing with the Chinese, having seen the Western fallen, and he knows he's next to be eaten. So he's in a bit of a no-win situation. He's combined with the Chinese because he doesn't like the West, but actually being last man standing with the Chinese means he goes too. At some stage, he might have to jump ship. And I didn't allude to that completely, but it's just like Stalin appeared to be friends with the Nazis, but ultimately ended up fighting them, and the friendship was just a momentary convenient alliance in the big construct of the game. So there's that balance there, but so it doesn't make any difference to how China wins in this book, which is by dominating the maritime terrain.
Within the book, the majority of combat takes place at sea, with the overwhelming offensive choice of China being saturation attacks. And that, I think, underpins a lot of what you say. So do you think the West is aware of the threat that saturation attacks pose to the navies of today? Do you think that they're preparing to fight that? Can they do the same to China? Can we saturate Chinese ships?
So saturation has been one of the strategic options of battle since the dawn of time. But if you look at naval hegemony, obviously Britain controlled by Pax Britannica the oceans. Then after the First World War, our grip was loosened because we were impoverished, and America started to become more relevant. The Japanese built their navy, and then the Germans tried, but stopped short of a battle fleet. Saturation was, for an example, with kamikaze attacks. They were successful when you saturated a ship, and they weren't successful if you were a lone plane. So saturation has been with us for a long time. Saturation was something that the US, the Russian forces, Soviet forces in the battle for the Atlantic sought to create against Western battle fleets. They wanted to use cruise missile technology that saturated defences. And after the Falklands War, where a Type 42 destroyer could be killed by 4 aeroplanes from 4 directions and 4 exocets, the reality for the Royal Navy was you needed to be able to destroy multiple targets. The Americans created the Aegis combat system with a Spy-2 radar, with the SM-2s, latest 3s and 6s, which are able to deal with relatively multiple targets. At any one time, an Aegis class ship, as I talk about, can track and control 28 missiles in the air. It requires 2 missiles per target, so it can cope with 14 missiles per defending destroyer or cruiser at any one time. The Royal Navy went a stage further with its Type 45 Sea Viper PAM system, and all 50 missiles can be launched within a minute, and they can be aimed at 50 independent targets. So you think about a Type 45 destroyer has the defensive capability of 3 Aegis class ships. Now the Spy-7 radar system, coming online not in time for this book, will start to address that balance for the US forces. What this means is that for the US forces with a ballistic missile defense capability with their SM-3s and 6s, if it carried all the 96 silo tubed in an Aegis class Block 3 ship, it can defend against each ship 14 incoming missiles per wave. Now, if the Chinese fire 50 missiles saturates 3 times 14, and you lose your carrier group. 50 missiles.
That doesn't seem like that much.
It isn't. The threshold for saturation is low, and that's the point of this book. Is what this book is really saying is that we don't have a high saturation level, we have a low saturation level. So at the moment there are enough of these DF-21s and 26s to remove the 3 carrier groups simultaneously, which means the Americans cannot interdict in Taiwan without unacceptable losses.
What are the PLAN saturation levels looking like compared to the West at the moment? So are they more prepared? Surely they must be more aware, because they're the ones that are preparing to saturate, so they would defend themselves.
We've gone to sleep. We don't have this class of technology. Ballistic weapons that launch glide weapons to 2,500 miles, soon to be many thousands because they put them on bigger ICBMs. We don't have anything like that. We've been reliant on cruise missiles for land attack, which is about out to 1,500 miles. Those cruise missiles are now being modified for sea usage. And most of our anti-ship weapons, the Harpoon, are now so outdated, that their combat radius is 80 miles, whereas the Chinese and the Russians have 200, 180-mile weapon systems. So we've completely neglected our at-sea ship-to-ship capabilities. And we've been focusing on our air defence, but not sufficiently against the threshold of saturation. Whilst we control under the oceans and our aeroplanes control above the oceans, our ships are highly vulnerable to surface-to-surface interactions or land-to-surface interactions. And that's what this book is all about, this window of opportunity the Chinese have, and they see it already. When I published the book, about a week later, there was a piece about the positioning of DF-21s on the Tibetan Plateau, which meant that those missiles could now reach the Gulf, which essentially meant that the Chinese could actually interdict all the way where their oil comes from the Gulf right the way to their shores. They're all within range of their 26s and DF-21s, which is the beginning of area denial to the whole planet when you put them on a bigger weapon. And that's really the jump in the thesis which I've made in the book.
Do you think that by 2025, which is the date you detailed, that is the danger date, the West will have updated its systems to be able to cope with this threat, or do you think not? Just honestly, yes or no?
I wrote the book because we're not prepared. We're not moving fast enough.
What's the likelihood of us getting prepared in time, right now, in your opinion?
0.
Okay, that's brutally honest.
And that's why in the book I highlight the fate of essentially one carrier group in the Philippine Sea with current technology, and they all get sunk, and then this carrier group based off the Iceland Faroes Gap, which have integrated in all the technology we could integrate, including a new design of ship, which I'll talk about in a minute, to counter a much higher level of saturation. So I believe this is not an impossible situation. I didn't just want to be Cassandra and say we're all doomed. What I'm really saying is there's a big threat and we need to wake up to it. And in the book, we do wake up to it. And I mentioned that the invasion of Taiwan, somewhere within the time frame of the next 12 months, was no different from the invasion of the Rhinelands in March 36. It woke up Britain and France and the European powers to the fact war was almost inevitable, and they started emergency rearmament programs. And I talk about an emergency shipbuilding program that starts to address this issue, but not in sufficient numbers to change the strategic balance.
Taiwan seems very similar to, like you said, the Rhineland, and Ukraine also seems in a way similar. The West is essentially promising to defend territories too far away to defend from aggressors that are getting more powerful every year, and it seems to be a formula for disaster.
Well, the Rhinelands were right next to France.
Taiwan's right next to China. Ukraine's right next to Russia.
No. So France could have easily put an army on the ground to kick out 12,000 German soldiers, which is all they had. And what's interesting is they didn't, because they were distracted by a gold crisis. And they didn't think they could manage a crisis and a war simultaneously, even though the calculation of that war would have been swift. So there's a thing about intent. There was no intent from the French government to defend their mandate or recognise that if you lose a bit, you lose a lot more. The problem with Taiwan is because of these DF-21s and 26s, that I don't think the US Navy could interdict with its current status and capability without severe losses, which then shows that America no longer dominates the waves. So by interacting, they choose to show everyone they can't do it at this stage. And essentially, if they don't act, they look weak either way. So, and I think I most advocate some kind of Ukraine-type event where there's a sort of revolution of pro-Chinese people that kill the leadership, ask for help from the Chinese, and so it isn't just an invasion, it's an annexation by apparent political invitation. And so there are. What is interesting is that if you can't control or support Taiwan, which is quite important in the American sphere of influence, how do you support Japan, which is the same distance away? It suddenly throws into huge concern the futures of everyone within inside the second island chain.
I think you're right. I think it casts a shadow of doubt on a hegemony that I think a lot of people in the West still believe to be present, and sadly, it's not there in the same form that it used to be. Like Britain, like the collapse of Rome, it's slowly declining, which is a happy thought.
I mean, there are a couple of I think the leaders of the US Navy are some of the smartest military leaders we have on the planet. They know this problem and they're desperately trying to work around it, find a solution. I don't think they have anyone I've met, and I've come in contact with an awful lot of senior admirals. None of them understand this particular threat. And as I highlight, when you look at Germany twice, when hegemony seeks or a challenging hegemony seeks to undermine the hegemony in control, they never have enough time and resources to match the power system that hegemony used to establish power, as in a large surface battle fleet in the case of the US Navy, and a huge number of carriers that act as the centerpieces of that strategy. So what they do is they seek an asymmetric advantage. And Germany did it twice. When it couldn't get its battle fleet to win after Jutland, or on the route, in fact, from 1911 onwards, they started to build submarines and almost strangled us once. In the Second World War, they tried the Z plan, realised they didn't have time and resources, again initiated a submarine build and almost strangled us twice. So that's an asymmetric challenge. The Russians or the Soviets did the same in the Cold War. It was their submarines that would have caused us the most grief in the Atlantic. So in this case, the Chinese are building a battle fleet that they see in time being comparable to America, but their fast track is an asymmetric challenge using these aerial denial weapons, ballistic weapons with hypersonic glide warheads.
Moving on to the idea of nuclear warfare in Red Lightning, which is notably absent. You detail that China stages a 3-day conventional shock and awe strike and disables the West naval supremacy through saturation attacks like you've just talked about. But I find it surprising that in 3 days of conventional assault, the West, losing rapidly, wouldn't think to use nuclear weapons in any way, shape or form, and China wouldn't have it in the back of their mind and they would continue their assault. Do you not find that surprising?
No, I frame this because it's a very important question. So imagine you're fighting a war over many months. You have enough time to think and consider, and you're losing the war. The loss of that war seems inevitable, and there would be a decision from leadership. Do we use a nuclear weapon to warn them to stop? This is something completely different. This is literally, it isn't 3 days. In truth, it's lost within 3 hours, because 10,000 missiles arrive and destroy every warship on the world's ocean simultaneously. Now that happens so quickly. Our nuclear response processes in the West are predominantly mutually assured destruction. Only do we retaliate instantly if we are attacked by nuclear weapons. And my whole point is this combat, this scenario, is below our current nuclear threshold. Now, there was an interesting piece, essentially, where in the Defence Review, that we revoked retaliatory use of nuclear weapons to allude to the fact that we could use them first, which is what the Russians have done, and Putin has been advocating a first-use policy of small nuclear weapons to keep what you've taken from the West. That's its strategy, and we've in Britain sort of opened the door to that. The reason why this is interesting is it's so quick. We would have no way to respond quickly enough, and then we're responding from a position of losing anyway. So I also don't believe that unlike Thatcher, and the story of Thatcher is interesting because her willpower to see the recapture of the Falklands 8,000 miles away at the height of the Cold War, I have no doubt that basically the Soviets changed their perception of weak capitalists, changed the perception that they could run into Europe with a huge Guards tank army and we wouldn't respond with nuclear weapons, and they never dared to do it. I don't think any of our leaders in the West have the steel of Thatcher or Reagan or any of the presidents which were in office in the Cold War. So I think that there is really a gamble for the Russian and Chinese that we won't do it.
But do you believe that leaders will rise to the occasion if the occasion arises?
Well, I do in rising systems. So, in Britain, although, it's been less prevalent in terms of great leadership than I'd like to see, we're seeing more right-brained lateral leadership. But as the pandemic saw, our ability to adapt swiftly, quickly and intelligently was really sorely lacking. And our collective governmental lack of understanding of military strategy has never been lower. So I don't think we're suddenly going to find that one to be a great improvement over the pandemic response. I think in America they have a much better strategic appreciation of force, and it's more likely to come from there even under a man like Biden. But I'm afraid Biden's signal to withdraw from Afghanistan, when you're talking about 2,500 troops, $2.5 billion a year, which is small as a fraction of total expenditure, and I think implies very quickly that the Taliban will be in control of Afghanistan and we will be back to where we were before 9/11. That is what I call a failed pilot war, a war that a hegemony fights, that's in an asymmetric paradigm that shows clear weakness in intention and capabilities. And in the First World War, it's preceded by the Boer War. It's well documented how the Kaiser used to laugh about a bunch of farmers running rings around the British Empire, and that emboldened him to make his challenge a decade later. And the Falklands War we talked about was a plus for the Cold War, and you could argue the Spanish Civil War and what went on there was just, again, another example of the Western powers not being prepared to stand up to aggression and police their backyard.
Well, that's it from us. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you do want to learn more about Dad, please go to www.davidmerrin.co.uk.